So as a courtesy, just confirming everybody that we are recording. This is the webinar for tackling wicked problems, or how to nail jelly to the wall, with Dr. Andres Mesner. What we'll do is go through the webinar, and you're very welcome to ask any questions as you go along, but they will be recorded. If you prefer not to, we can certainly use the chat or wait until the end when we'll switch off the recording and have an open questions. It'll then be followed on by the Professor Isin. Over to you, Dr. Andres.
Okay, so very much welcome to today's webinar about tackling wicked problems. And the general learning outcome, we hope, is for you to learn a bit on how to nail jelly to the wall and to develop an understanding of the weakness of problems. And more specifically, for you to understand what are wicked problems, to outline the characteristics of wicked problems, to look at linear cause and effect logic and why it won't be sufficient to tackle wicked problems. Further, to get an insight on how to work with wicked problems and to learn about available methods and techniques to research and potentially resolve wicked problems. And finally, to have a brief reflection, questions, and webinar wrap up. Now, with this, what are wicked problems? First of all, wicked problems are difficult to define. There are different stakeholders that have different versions of what the problem is, and no one version is complete or verifiable, right or wrong. They are evolving and continuously changing. That's the one thing. And on the other hand, there are no clear solutions, and proxy solutions are not verifiably right or wrong, but rather better or worse or good enough. And wicked problems have many interdependencies and multiple causes and internally conflicting goals. And they are socially complex rather than technical complex. So both can come together. And they cannot be treated with traditional linear and analytical approaches, as we will see later on. And they require rather a holistic approach than linear thinking. Now, once humans are involved, then the likelihood is great that things get messy. And once things get messy, then things become soon or quickly wicked. And we will outline that with two examples. The first example is a healthy school lunch case. Now, school canteens do no longer offer unhealthy food, which in general is a good thing to do. But as a consequence, the children no longer buy their lunch at the school canteens, but instead miss lunch, save their lunch money, or buy junk food at the shops on the way home from school. So as an outcome, some children may now eat even more unhealthy than they did previously. So you see, the intention was very good, but the situation might develop in a very unwanted way. And so all interconnections and social complexities need to be identified, discussed, and addressed as part of a coordinated strategy, so to avoid that a good intention has a negative consequence. And unintended consequences tend to occur even more frequently if the problem has been artificially tamed. That is, it has been too narrowly addressed, like in this case, by just not offering any longer unhealthy food. Now, depending on where you're looking and locating the problem, the research, from a research perspective, might go quite differently. Now, if you would ask what is exactly in the healthy meals that students do not like, then you would address different stakeholders, for example, than if you would ask the third question: how can we prevent students from buying junk food at the shops on the way home from school? Because in the third way, you would want to engage with students, parents, canteen staff, nutritionists, neighboring shop owners, councils, and municipalities. While for the first question, you would not necessarily need to engage with neighboring shops or with councils and municipalities. So stakeholders are very, very relevant and very important to be considered once working with wicked problems. Let's look into another potentially wicked problem. Now, this is a situation I experienced in a work environment some years ago. which was a research organization, and they were struggling to attract research funding. Now the situation goes like that. The leadership team want to push staff to write more research funding proposals to increase the organization's income, which as a leader is a clear ambition and clear objective. Now, the staff, on the other hand, are not motivated to spend time on writing research funding proposals. They prefer to use the time to do research instead. Obviously, if you're a researcher, this is what you like. Now, two from the scientific senior leadership team are skilled in writing research funding proposals, so they potentially could fuel in money. However, they only care about their own departments and do not help to build organizational capacity. Now, they could help the organization to perform better, but they decide not to do so. They only care for themselves. But to make it even worse, they consume any resources from other groups that they can get their hand on. So the human resource department, on the other hand, assumes that researchers are highly skilled, and the only type of training offered by the department is of a business nature. Now, the human resource department did not understand that researchers, like any other one, need to develop their skills continuously, and that human resource perhaps should support them in that. Now, the business development department, on the other hand, fails to see that the quality standard of the proposals are too low. They just see the proposals do not get through. But they didn't grasp why, what's happening here. And those that submit proposals are aware about this low quality, but they say, hey, anyway, I'm only asked to submit 3 or 4 proposals per year, so I will submit the number and I don't care if they fail. As long as I have my 3 to 4 submitted, I tick the box. Now, and to make things worse, there was no communication and knowledge management system in place in the organization, so they were only communicating either through email or meetings. And all of the knowledge that was created was never captured. So this is a very real situation. And if you face that from a research perspective, the question is, which are the possible research angles that you might need to address? Now, if you look into this, if you look into leadership issues, you might want to look into behavioral and leadership related matters. If you take the staff that's not motivated, then you might want to look at staffing. Why are you staffing in the way you do? What are the strategy issues? Not helping to build organizational capacity, again, it's a behavioral thing, but it's also a management issue. Now, for the case of the human research department, there are quite some angles you could be looking at: knowledge, ability issues, strategy and staffing issues, behavioral leadership issues, or communication. And likewise, for the business development, there is a whole set of things you could be looking at. So this single situation is very, very difficult to research from only one of the angles. So you need to have a clear understanding what are the angles, which of the angles are of relevance to what, and which are the stakeholders that relate to each angles. Are there any questions to that point? Okay, then let's look into the characteristics of WIC problems. Now, on the one hand, you have simple, tame, traditional problems, which are linear, and there's a clear definition for them. On the other hand, you have the WIC problems where there is no agreement and there's no such thing as true or false. So then there are different stakeholders that are involved. In the case of the tame problem, you have a clear understanding which are the stakeholders, while in the case of the WIC problem, stakeholders always change, and the relation of the stakeholders to the problem is also changing. And for a simple traditional tame problem, you have a stopping rule. You can solve the problem and afterwards the situation is better. Now, this is not the case once you look into WIC problems. And then the nature of the problem is also very different. In the tame problems, it's scientific-based protocols that guide the choice of solutions, while in the WIC problem case, solutions to problems are based on judgment of the stakeholders involved. So everything is changing, everything is arguable, and nothing will ever be finished. And there comes different types and different shapes of weakness depending on the clarity of the problem, but also the number of the parties involved, how many stakeholders with how many different views are in there. If you see the research organization example that I brought in, those were 5 or 6 stakeholder groups that could be already outlined, but each of the groups then can be broken down and there will be many different views depending on the job category you're looking at. So this is something that need to be worked out very gradually, and you need to get a clear understanding on the type of problem that you have at hand. And as you build up this understanding, so you gradually increase the knowledge base and also the capability on how to cope with it. If you look at this example here, which is from a collective learning and systems in Danish wind turbine industry case, at the initial stage on the left side, you see 8 points, 4 points, and 5 points. So those are the initial considerations that have been taken into account. And due to stakeholder engagements, 5 challenge areas could be then identified from A to E. And based upon that, gradually the solutions for each of those challenges could be worked out. So this is a gradual process. And we will look further into how those processes can be gradually built up. Now, another important understanding is why cause and effect logic is only of limited use once tackling big problems. Now, if we look into a tame traditional problem, then we can use a linear approach. We see a problem, we understand the causes, we see what are the effects, and then we can work out a solution. So this is a clear pathway that can be followed. And if we compare that to complex and wicked problems, then we see as more as we move to the right downside, as more we move away from linearity. We have unknown causes, we have unknown effects, uncertain estimable sequences, unknown emergent sequences, so things are moving. And this will lead to a different work approach, which might be illustrated as such, whereby you certainly do have still some elements of linearity, which you are seeing here on the right side. If you have a weak problem at hand, that doesn't mean that there's no linearity. It just means that next to the linearity, you also will have the non-linear aspects to be taken into account, which are here shown on the left side. And you see words like consensus, collaboration, values, expectations, opinions. Now, all of that is something that needs to be worked out, and that is very much dependent on humans that are involved into that. So humans, stakeholders, play a key role in any wicked problem situation. So it's important to understand that next to linear approaches, you also will have nonlinear approaches and ways of work. And we will look into those ways of work as we now go further. So, but before doing so, some basic considerations first. Wicked means that there is no quick fix or safe method to resolve the situation. And there might even be no way to resolve the situation. So you need to go there with an open-mindedness and understanding about that. And there will be stakeholders to whom the problem relates to. Therefore, collaborative approaches might be appropriate to change the situation for the better. Engagements and the boundaries need to be just right. If they are too broad, it can't be handled. If they are too narrow, boundaries might lead to a neglect of what is important in handling. Remember the school lunch case. Unwanted outcome of forbidding unhealthy food is kids eating even more unhealthy. And if you handle it just as a sub-problem rather than the big problem, then changes to the sub-problem might have unclear consequences to the bigger problem. So you also need to work out exactly what are the boundaries of the problem and what is the entire case. Remember the research organization example 2 earlier. Each of those elements must be known and worked out. Exactly. You also should engage in criteria-based reasoning. Now, if you engage in outcome-based reasoning, we want that our kids eat healthy, therefore the school canteen no longer offers unhealthy foods. We have seen that the outcome would be that kids might even eat more unhealthy or they do not eat at all. Now, if we would have used a criteria-based reasoning for the very same case and actions also, then we would have followed a different pathway. We would have checked what food is being served at the canteen. We would have identified the meals that are seen to be less healthy. We would have located the ingredients that they are seen to be less healthy. We would have sought out alternative, healthier ingredients that could provide the same taste. We would then have engaged with parents and kids to agree on a balanced weekly menu and change the weekly menu, collect regular stakeholder satisfaction feedback and adapt further as appropriate. And we would not have done the steps 1 to 6 alone, but under involvement of each of the stakeholders involved in each of the steps. So this is a very different ways of working and reasoning. And if we don't engage with stakeholders, then we don't need to be surprised if we don't make progress. So this is also important to understand. And as we engage, as we do all of that actions, we might also want to map the dialogue. What are we doing? What are we talking about? And how do things change? Mapping is a key enabler of afterwards, but also on action to share what's going on with these stakeholders and to engage. And this mapping can take a number of different ways. It can start over a clear whiteboard, but it might also make use of visualizations as we go along to exactly transmit the knowledge. Now, an important thing to understand also is when tackling a wicked problem has gone wrong, then you are the culprit and to be blamed. And this can have clear negative consequences to you. So it is important for you to think about, do you want to face those potential consequences? What are potential consequences? What might be mitigation strategies? And what do I need perhaps to anticipate? And yes, remaining inactive is a real option. Some problems are so complex that you have to be highly intelligent and well-informed to just be undecided about them. And walking away is an option. Now, let's look into methods and techniques to research and potentially resolve wicked problems. Now, this is an 8-step approach that we have been working with our students on, which has worked fairly well, but there are different approaches. But let's take this one now. Now, step 1, work out the problem and issue statement, which anyway, if you are doing research, is advisable to do at the beginning. So show the system dimension to the problem, where the problem can be located, and the key literature to it. Build up a common understanding will be paramount for any communication and conversation. So know what you're talking about and how things evolve over time. Remember the dialogue mapping earlier. This is a good mean to keep that understanding. Now, questions that might be addressed at this early point is, what is the work-life-based problem or issue? What can be observed about it? Who has experienced such issues prior to you, and what can be learned from it? Yeah. As a second step, build up an understanding what is happening. The different identified parts of the problem should be clearly outlined, as well as observable or assumed direct and indirect cause and effect relationships. Remember earlier, on the right side, you had the linear matters. On the left side, you have the wicked manners of the problem. So how do they go together? Work that out. And it should be drawing on evidence base as much as possible. Even if you perhaps don't see cause and effect relations, there might be some other evidences, anecdotal evidence included, that is observable. So questions at that point in time is, what are the different parts of the problem? Are there any apparent relations? And what is known from the literature? Again, literature can drive and guide you on how to frame the problem. And those techniques are very appropriate to engage with stakeholders, but also to perhaps keep an overview. If you take a whiteboard, obviously, like at the left side, at one point that will be full. If you look at the right side, there's a paper below all of the post-its. So this can be taken off from the wall and folded and kept for later. So those are techniques that you might want to train. Now, the different scientific disciplines from which the problem could be approached should be clearly outlined. Remember earlier, the research organization case, there were many different areas. And as more precisely as you can work them out, as better you can get the problem laid down. And you also should understand what are urgencies in there, because urgencies always can make the problem worse. And therefore, prioritization should be supported through concepts or methods identified within the literature that tells you on how to deal with it. So at this point in time, questions that you might have are, what are the different scientific disciplines? How can I prioritize the identified scientific disciplines? And you might not be, but in case you are, that would be good. And what concepts or methods does the literature provide us and that we could build on? Now, with regards to the third, this, for example, is taken from the literature. It shows you on the left side the dimensions that you might want to consider problem itself, but also the dimensions for each of the stakeholders. What are possible causal categories that relate to the problem? What are more detailed dimensions? And what is the scale of witness? Now, this type of constructs from the literature, frameworks, tools can help you to quicker outline the problem. And ideally, they come from related studies that have been looking at similar things already previously. Now, as noted, stakeholder identification and working with stakeholders is paramount once working with big problems. So you should try as early as possible to engage with those stakeholders. Now, and therefore, we also use 5 slides on this part. You might want to work out what are the steps and strategies that could be adopted. And this can start very simple until you come to such a more detailed. So you have the rationale, what are you doing? You have the typology, and you have the methods for each of the typology that you use, identifying stakeholders, differentiating between and categorizing stakeholders, and investigation of relationships between the stakeholders. Now, those are all very linear ways of working within such a nonlinear situation. And as you go along, you can map out the when, how, and why of stakeholder engagement, formal versus informal, process-based versus output-based. All of those things need to be taken into account. And as you develop a clear understanding about the stakeholders, you also then exactly can bring in evidence and any data that you find in a more structured way through the use, for example, tables or other forms like exactly those visualizations that allow you to understand how things relate to each other, what can be grouped, or at a very later point, how the full situation looks like. Now, in this framework is taken from a large-scale European Union project, which will have taken typically 2 to 3 years. Now, for a doctoral level research, perhaps this is out of reach to hit this type of complexity or overview. Having said that, it also depends on what you're exactly focusing on. But you see, as you go along, you can move from very simple diagrams and very simple relations towards more sophisticated illustrations and visualizations of the situation. Now, quick heads up, we are halfway through the 8 steps, and ultimately, this is not a linear process. Yeah, it's like a wig problem is not working over causal linearity. Likewise, this process, the 8 steps, that we are now here presenting. It's likely not you do it from the beginning till end and all good, but a juggling front and back will be required. It's much as research that is equally not linear. I think this is a very important understanding one needs to have. So how do we engage with stakeholders once we know who they are? How do we uncover the different parts of the problem and understand how the various stakeholders perceive them? How do we apply the relevant techniques and methods and get out what we want to learn? Now, for the start, I found Tom's approach on how to make toast very illustrative on how to start off engaging with stakeholders. So I highly recommend for you to take a look at it, how you can move from a simple sketch on how to draw, how to make toast, towards something more complex that outlines how the situation of the problem you are having at hand gradually and take the stakeholders by hand. Now, this needs to be clearly trained, and it will take some time for you, if you haven't done that previously, to move towards getting the stakeholder tacit knowledge out into something more explicit, like in this case shown. But once you're managing to do so, then you might move towards observable pattern and themes. So you might see how things apparently relate together, for which of the stakeholder groups and from which perspective. And at that point in time, you might be able to answer questions like, what are the apparent observable patterns of the issue? Are there patterns in the cause-effect relationships? And what are the patterns generally? And how do the observations compare to those within the earlier consulted literature, which then allows you to move also from a literature perspective a bit more deeper into what can be learned from the literature with regards to address the problem. So gradually you will move from the left side towards the right side, and from over there into a more complex and sophisticated illustration of the situation. Now, how you present it will depend very much on the type of problem and also the type of literature you will be taking on board. So you can expect anything from very simple patterns like at the left side towards very sophisticated and computer-driven like on the right side. Now, as you build up the knowledge and understanding about the problem, you will also understand what are the means of tackling the problem, or the different parts of the problem. What are the risks of tackling the problem and issues? And based on that, you can develop taming attempts and see and evaluate whether or not they are advisable. At that point in time, questions that might be addressed is, are there any means of tackling the WIC problem anyway? And what are the lessons to be learned from the literature on these taming attempts? The second is in particular valuable for you to understand whether or not to act. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, there are three strategies respectively aim to reflect, reduce, or resolve a WIC problem. Holistic strategies aim to resolve WIC problems as comprehensively as possible, often without specifying any stopping rules. Then you have taming strategies that aim to reduce WIC problems to make them more controllable and manageable. And then you have coping strategies that aim to reflect and fragmented, uncertain and ambiguous nature of WIC problems by relying on a more disjoint and tentative process of formulating policy responses. And you see the literature resource below. Please take a look at it to get a better understanding on these three strategies and how they might be used. And the following assessment of the alternative strategies did not seek to present a panacea for the governance of WIC problems. To the contrary, as the analysis has aimed to show there should be no ambiguity as to the fact that in dealing with wicked problems, the choice is between approaches that offer well-known but potentially calculable deficiencies and those that offer high expectations but even more uncertain prospects. Wicked problems are called wicked for a reason. Debating how to tackle this type of problem, Wexler warns, invites knowledge hypes and false assurances, it motivates those in the business of selling solutions to downplay the intractable and unsolvable nature of these problems. Now, why is this important? Because coming in with the word solving and solution is very tempting, right? If we talk about a wicked problem and say it's by definition not solvable, that is also something we need to keep us reminding. And whenever we take a look into the literature, we need to question how valid is what we read there. Do they now tell us we get out with something solvable? And then why? How does that relate to the nature of the non-solvable nature of wicked problems, right? So please always take a look, critical look on the literature, on what is offered to you. And finally, with all of the knowledge at hand, with all of the literature reviewed, with all of the analytics done, we need to take a decision. Is it advisable to act, sense, and respond to tame the problem? Or is it more appropriate to stay inactive or to walk away? Now, this is something we need to answer to us. And there are good guidances that can help us to identify what to do. I here just presented two, and depending on the type of the wickedness of the problem, we then need to identify what are the appropriate strategies that we might want to adopt and what are the actions. Do we want, like in the left case, to have emergent practice at hand? Do we probe, sense, and respond? Do we follow a good practice? Do we sense, analyze, and respond? Is it a novel practice? Do we act, sense, and respond? Or is it a best practice? Do we sense, categorize, and respond? You see, based upon the knowledge that you generated, you will be clearly in the clear position to define any possible actions and to evaluate whether or not you should or could be taking these. Now, if you want to learn more about those 8 stages and 8 steps, then take a look at our course that we have on offer, which comes in 3 formats: free self-study with peer support, fully tutored, or with flexible on-demand feedback. Now, alternatively, if you want to discuss a bit about wicked problems or about your research as such, be welcome to join our regular discussions in one of our clubs. The clubs are something that we're launching recently, like 3-4 months ago, and we are still building them up further. The idea here is that we will provide you with a full journey from start to end. So we identified 6 clubs from start till end that will take you by hand, and wherever you are, will offer you weekly or regular discussion sessions, so to get some feedback and guidance and orientations. And we will go from those 6 clubs to 25 session themes and courses over the months and years to come. So with this, we will go off the record, literally speaking, and to open the floor for a closing discussion round. And with this, Jack, might I ask you to stop the recording?
Stop recording. Okay, thank you. Just to let you know,